So these are all body hacks, because remember, it's the hypothalamus that has its hand on the panic button. It's directing that fight, flight, freeze response. And even though we've been talking about the panic button, it's really more like a light switch. So you're always either in fight, flight, freeze or rest and digest at any given time. And you can exploit that aspect of how you're biologically structured to help control your emotions. Because what that means is that the switch can't be flipped. You can't flip a light switch on and off at the same time. So if you find a way to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, to engage the rest and digest response, it pulls you down out of fight or flight. So I'm going to give you some physiological hacks that you can use to make your lizard brain flip the switch and turn on rest and digest. So I have 4 of them, and I'm going to send you a document that summarizes what I'm about to say. I'm going to go through it kind of fast, so don't feel that you have to take copious notes right now, because I'm going to send it to you. Okay, so the first one works by pitting one reflex against another. And the other 3 work by directly engaging the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the rest and digest response. So the first one, when you are already caught up in a moment of fight, flight, freeze. So, in the lectures last week, we looked at strategies you can use to engage rest and digest, and we looked at investments you can make in your bodily health that will make fight, flight, freeze less common. And that included everything from getting regular exercise to doing the work to process some past traumas so that your nervous system becomes less reactive. But let's just say none of that has worked. You're out in the world, you're living your life, and you are suffering from fight, flight, freeze at an inconvenient moment. So, you're at a work party, someone said something really irritating, and you find yourself flying into a rage, feeling fight, flight, freeze, and you feel like you could punch them. Or you just got a terrible text, getting dumped by someone you really liked who you've been dating for a while, and you feel like you're going to throw up, and you start sweating, and your breath comes fast. So now the fight, flight, freeze is activated, and it's time to do something to stop it. So here are the hacks. The first one is to dunk your face into ice water and leave it submerged for about 30 seconds, as long as you can stand. I am way too wimpy to do this now on the Zoom. I'm dedicated to this job, but not that dedicated. Plus I have a meeting later, so I don't want to, submerge my headset. But the reason this works is that we have a different ancient mammalian reflex that's even older and more basic than fight or flight. And it's called diving brachycardia. That'll be in the Word document. You don't have to try to write it down, but it's your body's way of trying to prevent you from dying if you fall into icy water, which is probably not something you worry about happening every day, but it was relatively common for our ancestors. We actually have a lot of frozen specimens of Paleolithic people who fell into icy water, because most of the time period that we were evolving was actually the last ice age. So it was a pretty common threat, and it's something that happens to animals still. So what your body does when you fall into ice water, the diver's reflex or diving brachycardia, it brings all of the blood to the center of your body, and it dramatically slows your heart rate and respiration. And the purpose of this is simply trying to keep your core temperature going long enough that you stay alive long enough to climb out of the frozen lake. And that happens to be kind of the opposite of the fight, flight, freeze response, which gets your respiration going and your heart pumping and kind of speeds everything up. So when you pit one reflex against another, you can interrupt fight, flight, freeze. Okay, this is not a very convenient hack. It's in fact so inconvenient I was unwilling to demonstrate it live for you on Zoom, but it's good to remember. I would do this if I, had terrible news and I felt myself spiraling and I was at home. I would absolutely dunk my head in ice water. If my roommate, or in my case, my kid, seemed like they might be starting to go into an anxiety attack and really needed some intense emotional first aid, that's something I would try. So it's just something good to remember, keep in the back of your mind. All right, hack number 2. Now this works by directly engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, and I am going to be gutsy enough to try it. So hack number 2 is grab a fistful of ice and squeeze it in your hand for as long as you can stand. Okay, again, I admit this is not highly convenient. Although in the situation I described before, where you're at a party and you feel like punching someone, there's probably, some drinks on ice, and you could go squeeze ice instead of starting a fist fight, which is probably better for your life. Oh my gosh, this feels terrible. I can't go for much longer. So the reason that this works is by triggering something called the pain offset reflex. And again, the document I'm sending will describe it. Oh, this is horrible. So what happens is, remember, the brainstem is there to set off the fight, flight, freeze response in response to physical pain. So when I first grabbed this fistful of ice, oh, this is tough. When I first grabbed the fistful of ice, my body went into a higher state of fight, flight, freeze because I'm in physical pain. But when I finally let go and the pain is over, the brainstem, noticing that the pain is done, it assumes you're out of danger, and it begins the pain offset response, which turns on the parasympathetic nervous system and brings rest and digest mode. So if you were feeling stressed, anxious, angry, if you had a high fight, flight, freeze activation before you grab the ice, the relief of the pain when you let the ice go is going to trigger that rest and digest calming effect in the body. And yeah, I'm kind of feeling it a little bit right now. So questions about how that works, the pain offset relief effect. One really smart question someone asked me last year at this point in the lecture was, is that what people are seeking when they engage in self-harm behavior? And I thought that was a very perceptive question. So, self-harm is really complex and people turn to it for a variety of reasons. But one reason that it might be reinforcing and have a bit of an addictive quality for some folks who are struggling with self-harm is that when they engage in injurious behavior like cutting, they are triggering that pain offset relief. And so they're getting a little bit of relief from the uncomfortable fight, flight, or freeze symptoms they've been dealing with by tricking the brainstem with a little bit of pain. Now, it's not a great way to go because a lot of self-harm practices could potentially cause injury, damage, death. But if you can use a bit of ice or maybe an intense exercise to create a bit of harmless pain that won't do any damage to your body, you can use the pain offset reflex or the pain offset response to get a little relief from overwhelming fight, flight, freeze. So those are hacks 1 and 2. We have 2 left. The third body hack to interrupt a cycle of fight, flight, freeze is much more practical. We're sort of going from least practical to most practical. And it is exercise. So about 10 minutes of very vigorous exercise can stop the fight, flight, freeze response and bring on the rest and digest response. And the reason that that works is, remember, the hypothalamus, in charge of the panic button with its hand on the light switch that toggles between fight, flight, freeze, and rest and digest, is part of your lizard brain. It really doesn't have a sophisticated sense of what's actually going on in the outside world around you. It's listening mostly to your inside world, listening to the body. So if you're feeling panicky, if you're feeling high flight, fight, freeze symptoms, and you actually give your body something to do that to your lizard brain will seem a lot like fighting or fleeing. So if you just go on like a vigorous run, sprinting, or you just do some kickboxing, or you just do big body motion that gets you absolutely at your aerobic edge for 10 or 15 minutes, your lizard brain will think, we did it, guys. We fought. We fled. Crisis is over. And then as you come back to the resting state from the exercise, your lizard brain will decide, let's head over to rest and digest mode and repair the damage created by all this stressful situation because we're done. We fought. We fled. Now, your hypothalamus doesn't know you were doing kickboxing instead of actually wrestling with a wild animal. Does that make sense? So investing in your cardiovascular health long-term helps make the fight, flight, freeze response a little less reactive. But even if you aren't a big exerciser or super fit, using a burst of intense exercise can calm you out of a fight, flight, freeze response. So I work as a volunteer suicide counselor, and that job is very stressful, and I'm scared every single time I do it. So part of how I use brain science to help me prepare for that intense volunteer job and sort of show up at my best is that I always go for a run about an hour before I start my shift, because I'll be nervous the night before the shift. I'll be nervous all morning leading up to the shift, but I find that I go on that run and it clears that fight, flight, freeze energy so I can actually focus and be a better helper to the clients that contact me on the suicide prevention service. So last physical hack. And this one you can use anytime, anywhere. And it's simply to alter your breathing. So when we see someone distressed, a little kid having a temper tantrum, or your boyfriend or girlfriend or non-binary friend wigging out over something that happened at work, one thing we tend to say to people who are really worked up is take a breath. Sometimes take a deep breath. And that's very close to good advice. What we should really be telling ourselves and our loved ones is take a long exhale. So we've been saying how all of these automatic processes managed deep down in the lizard brain operate under the level of our conscious control. So when the pons is generating your dreams, you don't have to do any conscious thought to make that happen. When the medulla is running your respiration and heart rate, you actually can't consciously control that. You have no conscious control over any of the brainstem regions, and so you can't consciously make yourself go out of fight or flight. But there is one aspect of these involuntary body processes that you do have a little conscious control over, and that is breathing. We can alter our breathing, and it turns out that altering our breathing has an effect on some of the bodily functions that are outside of our control. So breathing and respiration are linked. When you're inhaling, your heart speeds up just a tiny bit. And when you're exhaling, your heart slows down just a tiny bit. Your heart rate slows down just a tiny bit. And usually those are perfectly in sync, your inhales and exhales, and they're timed with your heart rate. So when your heart starts beating fast, your breath starts coming faster. And that can happen in the beginning of fight or flight. But you can make yourself breathe slower. So we're actually all going to practice it now. So I'm going to count it off for you. You're going to inhale for 4 counts, and then you're going to exhale for 8. And when you do the exhale, it kind of helps if you make your mouth like you're blowing bubbles through a bubble wand, because it just helps the air come out nice and slow. Okay, so let's all prepare. So exhale a little bit, and now you're going to inhale 2, 3, 4, and exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that should be. And when you take that long, slow, lung emptying exhale, your heart rate slows just a bit. And if you engage in that breathing pattern for about a minute, you'll bring your heart rate down. And it can help pull you out of a fight, flight, freeze moment. And I actually got to use this hack last year. When I was teaching this class, I had to go in for an emergency surgery. I'm fine. It went great. Everything's fine. But of course, it was scary and it was painful. I wasn't put under general anesthesia. I just had like, a Tylenol and a prayer. So I felt the procedure. It was really gnarly. It's some of the most pain I've ever been in. And of course, it caused my hypothalamus to kick off an enormous fight, flight, freeze response because I was in dramatic physical pain. So my blood pressure went up, my heart rate went up, I was sweating, I thought I was going to barf, all of these classic examples of really high fight, flight, freeze reaction. And after the surgery was over, I got some, instructions. And then before I could be discharged, they took a blood pressure reading. My blood pressure was higher than I've ever seen it measured in a doctor's office before in my life. It was a little alarming. But being a brain scientist, I said, hang on, measure me again in 1 minute. While I was sitting there in the blood pressure cuff, I used this exact breathing technique. In for 4 counts, out for 8. And after 1 minute, they took my blood pressure again, and it was lower than any reading I've ever gotten in a doctor's office. It was so cool. I was my own Mr. Wizard doing a science experiment with my brain that day, and it allowed me to chill my body enough to get released from the hospital. So you can do that one anytime, anywhere, right before an exam, when you're picking up the phone after you see a scary name on caller ID. I was even using it before I knew what it was or why it existed. So when my family hears me go, my kids always like, Mom, why are you stressed? Because they know that I'm managing my autonomic nervous system. So I hope those hacks are helpful, and I'll send you the review document. And they're all about convincing the hypothalamus, the lizard brain, to ease up on the panic button by altering your bodily state.